She was the only one who spoke kindly to the beggar at the gate. Then he revealed he was Lord. The gatekeeper's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Away with you. Move on, or I'll call the dogs." Janet Barker heard it from 20 feet back, the iron smell of the November frost still sharp in her lungs from the walk across the south lawn. She had been carrying a parcel of mended linens back to the main house, a task beneath the station she had once held and perfectly suited to the one she now occupied, when the scene at the gate stopped her cold. The man at the iron bars was old, or appeared so. His coat had been good once, she could see that. The cut was right, though the fabric had surrendered its shape to weather and years. He was not begging in the way one usually heard about. No outstretched palm, no wretched appeal. He simply stood, quietly, as if waiting for something that had nothing to do with charity. "He's probably diseased," said one of the footmen, leaning on the gatepost with his arms folded. Thomas, his name was. He was 19 years old and had never in his life gone hungry. Janet looked at the man's hands. His fingers were curled around the bars of the gate, not gripping, just resting. There was something in the stillness of him that she recognized. The particular posture of someone who had learned to take up very little space in order to avoid being noticed. She knew that posture intimately. She set the parcel of linens on the stone wall beside the path, unpinned the small cloth from the top of it, and reached inside for the roll she had taken from the breakfast table. A habit she had developed not from hunger, but from the memory of hunger. From the year after her father's death, when hunger had been a daily companion. The gatekeeper saw her coming and straightened. "Miss Barker, this is no business of—" "Open the bars, please," she said, not loudly. He did not open the bars, but she was close enough now to pass the roll through the gap, and she did. The man looked at the bread in his hands for a long moment before he looked at her. His eyes, she noticed, were not the eyes of a man who had spent his life on the road. They were steady and dark, and they saw her in the way that most eyes in this house did not. "You are kind," he said. His voice was quiet and low, educated in a way that caught at something in her attention. "You are cold," she replied. "Kindness is just sense in weather like this." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "What is your name, miss?" she told him. It was not a thing she typically offered to strangers, but something in the question felt less like curiosity and more like a record being made. "I will not forget it," he said. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away down the lane, his coat settling around him like a man who had somewhere important to be. Janet watched him go until he disappeared around the bend in the road. Then she picked up her linens and went inside to face what she already knew was waiting for her. Lady Harris's drawing room smelled of lavender and cold decisions. "You understand the situation," Lady Harris said, not looking up from the letter she was composing. Her pen moved with the efficiency of a woman who had been delivering bad news for 40 years and had grown comfortable with it. "My niece arrives from Bath in a fortnight. She will require the companion suite." "I understand," Janet said. "You have been satisfactory." Lady Harris set down her pen and looked at Janet with the expression one uses when dismissing a piece of furniture that has served its purpose. "I will write you a reference. It will be honest. Satisfactory. 3 years of managing the household correspondence, reading aloud until her voice gave out, teaching the younger Harris daughters their French and their watercolors and their deportment. And she was satisfactory. "Thank you," Janet said, because she had learned long ago that gratitude was the only currency she could afford to spend freely. She was 26 years old. She had 11 pounds to her name, a younger brother at school whose fees would come due in March, and a reference from a woman who considered her satisfactory. She walked back to her room past the portrait gallery, past the faces of people who had been born into certainty, and she told herself what she had been telling herself for 8 years. I will not break. I will simply find another door. She did not know that the door had already found her. 11 days later, a carriage arrived at Harris Hall that had no business being there. Janet heard it from the upper landing. Not the carriage itself, but the sudden change in the quality of the silence downstairs. The kind of silence that precedes someone important. The staff moved differently. She could hear it in their footsteps, the altered rhythm of activity below. She was at the top of the stairs with a stack of Lady Harris's correspondence when he walked through the front door, and she understood the silence immediately. She did not see him first. She felt the shift in the air of the entrance hall below, the way conversation died not from politeness but from something more instinctive, and she looked down over the railing. He was removing his gloves with the unhurried precision of a man who had never in his life needed to hurry for anyone. He did not look up. He did not need to. The room was already his. Lady Harris had materialized from the drawing room with a speed that Janet had not previously known the woman capable of. Lord Major. Her voice held the particular register of a woman who had just been caught unprepared and was compensating. "We were not expecting—" "No," said Lord Major. "You were not." Janet descended 2 steps and stopped. He was the beggar, not obviously, not in the way that made her doubt herself. But she knew that stillness. She had seen those eyes. And there was something in the angle of his chin, the particular patience of a man who had stood at an iron gate and waited without shame, that confirmed it before her reason could object. She descended the remaining stairs because stopping would have drawn more attention than continuing, and she set the correspondence on the hall table with hands that did not shake, because she had long practice with hands that did not shake. He turned then, not because he heard her, because he was looking for her. Their eyes met. He held the contact for exactly 1 second longer than courtesy required, and in that second, something passed between them that she could not name and would not try to. Then his attention returned to Lady Harris, and he was entirely unremarkable again. Composed, correct, aristocratic in the particular way of men who have never had to be anything else. "I am looking for a companion," he said. "I have it on good authority that you employ one." "Miss Barker." Lady Harris blinked. She is to be released at the end of the fortnight, my lord. My niece—" "I will take the fortnight." Janet looked at him directly then, which was the wrong thing to do and the only honest thing she could manage. "My lord," she said, "I'm standing in this room." Something in his expression shifted. It was barely visible. A slight easing around the eyes. A fraction of warmth that was gone almost before it arrived. "Yes," he said, "I am aware. Then perhaps you might speak to me, rather than about me." Lady Harris made a sound like a woman swallowing a small animal. Lord Major looked at Janet for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Barker, I have a ward. She is 11 years old and has consumed 3 governesses in 2 years. I am offering you a position at Major Park for a period of 6 months, with a salary of £40 and accommodation provided. You may decline." He paused. "I would prefer you did not." £40. The sum arrived in Janet's mind and stayed there, very still, like a bird that had landed somewhere unexpected and was deciding whether to trust the branch. "I would require a day to consider," she said. "You have an hour." He picked up his gloves from the table and turned toward the door. "I will take tea in the library." He walked away without waiting to be led, which meant he already knew where the library was, which meant this visit was not as unplanned as it appeared. Janet watched the door close behind him and stood for a moment in the reconfigured air of the hallway. She did not accept because she was desperate, though she was. She did not accept because of £40, though £40 would save her brother's education and leave enough to breathe. She accepted because of the way he had looked at her through iron bars in the cold, with eyes that had seen her when nothing in this house had. And because the man she had given bread to at a gate was apparently a lord who had come to her employer's house specifically to offer her work, and she needed to understand why. She told Lady Harris she was accepting. Lady Harris looked relieved in a way that confirmed she had known more about this arrangement than she was willing to say. Janet filed that information away and said nothing. Major Park announced itself through the carriage window on a gray November afternoon as a building constructed to endure rather than to welcome. Stone the color of old pewter, windows that faced the surrounding moors with the expression of a man who had decided long ago not to hope for pleasant weather. Janet had been in houses like this before. She knew their logic. They were built by people who understood that beauty was a luxury, and permanence was the only currency that outlasted everything else. She could work with permanence. The ward was named Diane Peguero, and she was not, as Janet had been told, difficult. She was lonely and angry and very intelligent, which in an 11-year-old presents as difficult only to people who mistake intelligence for defiance. The first governess, Janet learned from Mrs. Boyd, the housekeeper, a compact woman of 60 with the kind eyes of someone who had watched this household from within for 31 years, had left because Diane had corrected her mathematics in front of the other staff. And was Diane wrong? Janet asked. Mrs. Boyd looked at her with something that might have been cautious approval. No, miss, she was not. The second governess had lasted 3 weeks before departing with no explanation beyond a letter to Lord Major that Mrs. Boyd described as emotional in tone. The third had been found weeping in the library by Diane herself, which Diane had apparently found bewildering rather than triumphant. She said it was the quiet. Diane told Janet on their third evening together, both of them sitting by the fire in the schoolroom with a map of the Roman Empire spread between them. She said the house was too quiet. "Do you find it too quiet?" Janet asked. Diane considered the question seriously, which was her habit. "No, I find it honest. Noise is usually people pretending." Janet looked at the child for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I think that's true." Diane went back to her map, and Janet, who had not been agreed with by anyone in approximately 8 years, sat very still and felt something cautiously loosen in her chest. She saw Lord Major at dinner, which was formal and brief. He sat at the head of the table with the manner of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than sharing a meal, and he spoke to her about Diane's progress in the measured way of someone conducting an employment review. She answered him in the same register, because it was the one he had established, and she had not yet been invited into any other. But she watched him. Not in the way she watched everything, cataloging exits and social risks and the moods of people with power over her, but in a different way. The way she watched a piece of music she did not yet understand. He was careful. That was the word that kept returning to her. Not cold, though he appeared cold. Careful. Every gesture, every word had been considered before it was produced. He wasted nothing and revealed nothing, and the cost of maintaining that level of control was visible if you knew where to look. In the slight set of his jaw at the end of a long evening, in the way his hands rested on the table, absolutely still, with the concentrated stillness of something being held in check. Mrs. Boyd told her, 3 weeks into Janet's time at Major Park, over tea in the housekeeper's sitting room, that Lord Major had been engaged to be married 7 years ago. The woman's name had been Eliza Farrow, and she had been by all accounts beautiful and accomplished, and perfectly suited to the position of a lord's wife. She had been corresponding with Lord Major's younger cousin, who stood to inherit Major Park if Kelly died without issue, for the entirety of their engagement. "He found the letters," Mrs. Boyd said quietly. "He did not make a scene. He did not denounce her. He simply ended it and sent her a gift. A pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to his mother, with a note that said he hoped she would be happy." Janet held her teacup and thought about a man who had sent pearl earrings to the woman who had betrayed him. "He has not been unkind since," Mrs. Boyd said, "only closed." Janet thought of the gate, of the bars between them, of the way he had stood and waited without humiliation, because he had decided something about himself that the gatekeeper's contempt could not touch. "He tests people," Janet said. It was not quite a question. Mrs. Boyd looked at her steadily. He did not find what he was looking for, most times. A pause. Until recently, perhaps. Janet set her cup down and said nothing. But that evening, in the upstairs corridor, she passed the door to his study and heard him through it. Not speaking, not working. There was a small sound, brief and deliberately quiet, as though something had been set down with more force than intended, and he had caught it before it could fall. She stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked to the kitchen, made a second cup of tea, and left it on the small table outside the study door. In the morning, the cup was gone. She did not mention it, neither did he. But the following evening at dinner, he said, without preamble, "Diane tells me you have been teaching her cartography." "She has an interest in geography," Janet said. "She has an interest in everything that is not on the standard curriculum." He said it without criticism. My sister was the same. Janet waited because a man who mentions a sister in that tone has more to say and will say it when he is ready. He did not say it that evening. But he looked at her once, at the end of the meal, with an expression that contained something she had seen before and still could not name, something that lived between recognition and reluctance. And then he wished her a good evening and left the room. That night, Janet sat at her desk and looked at the sealed letter that had arrived for her 4 days ago, redirected from Lady Harris's. She had not opened it because she had learned that some letters were better opened when you were ready to receive their contents, and she had not yet been ready. She opened it now. The school fees had increased. The new sum was £62 for the spring term. Janet set the letter down on the desk. She looked at her hands. Then she looked at the walls of this room, which were solid and warm and not her own. And she told herself calmly that she would think of something. And she had always thought of something. She just needed more time. 6 weeks into her time at Major Park, on a Thursday afternoon when the winter had settled in earnest and Diane had been sent to bed with a cold, Janet went to the library to return 2 books she had borrowed. The library was supposed to be empty. Lord Major had ridden out that morning and had not yet returned, and the library was his room in the way that certain rooms belong to certain people. Not through legal title, but through the specific gravity a person leaves behind them in a space they inhabit consistently. He was there. He had returned early, or quietly, or both, and he was standing at the far window with his back to the door, reading a letter with the stillness of a man who has just been handed something he needed to think about before reacting to. Janet turned to leave. "Miss Barker," she stopped. He turned. His face was arranged, though she could see the effort of it in the exact line of his mouth. In his hand, the letter. He folded it once in half and set it on the shelf beside him with the deliberate care of something being removed from view. "Sit down," he said. She sat, because the tone was not a command, but a request that had not yet learned how to ask. "I owe you a conversation," he said. He remained standing, and she could not tell if it was courtesy or a need to retain some advantage of position. "About the gate." Janet folded her hands in her lap. "You don't owe me anything." Nevertheless, he moved to the chair across from her and sat, not with the usual ease of a man in his own library, but with the carefulness of someone lowering himself into territory he was uncertain of. "I have done it before, gone out onto the road, to see how the people of my household and my tenants behave when they believe they are unobserved. It is not an admirable habit." He paused. "It is an honest one." "I know why you do it," Janet said, and then immediately wished she hadn't, because his eyes sharpened. "Do you?" It was not a question. She answered it anyway, because the alternative was to pretend she hadn't spent 6 weeks thinking about it. "Someone taught you that what people perform and what they are different things. And the lesson was expensive enough that you decided to verify before trusting again." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. "Mrs. Boyd speaks freely," he said finally. "Mrs. Boyd speaks honestly, which is different. I asked her. She told me the minimum she thought I needed to know." Janet met his eyes. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter, because it does. I'm also not going to tell you it explains everything, because it doesn't." Something in his face did not change exactly, but it shifted. The way ice shifts when the temperature beneath it has altered. Not breaking, not visibly moving, but no longer entirely solid. He said, "I wrote to Lady Harris before I came. I know. I asked about the staff. I know that too. She described you as satisfactory." The word landed with something that was almost humor, dark-edged. which is, I suspect, the most inadequate description of a human being I have encountered since reading my father's will. Janet felt something that was not quite amusement pull at the corner of her mouth before she could prevent it. She was accurate within her terms of reference. She was blind within her terms of reference. He said it as a statement of fact. Then, before she could respond, "Your salary. I know it is not sufficient." Janet's hands, folded in her lap, tightened once. "It is a generous salary, Miss Barker." His voice was quiet. "I know about your brother's school fees." The room became very still. Outside, she could hear the wind off the moors pressing against the library windows. "How?" she said. And it was not the steady voice she had intended. It was the voice of a woman who had been keeping something private by force of will and had just felt the will fail. "Your brother wrote to you here, 3 weeks ago. The letter was left on the hall table before Mrs. Boyd could have it redirected. I saw the address. I recognized the school." He said the next part with the quiet care of a man who knows he's walking on uncertain ground. "My ward's previous guardian attended the same school. I know the fees increased in autumn, substantially." Janet looked at the fire. She breathed through the thing that was trying to rise in her throat. Not grief, not exactly, but the particular feeling of having been seen in the moment when you most needed not to be seen. And when she trusted her voice again, she said, "I do not require charity. I know that." Something in his tone stopped the next sentence she had ready. "I'm not offering it. I'm offering to adjust the terms of your employment. Retroactively, if you prefer. I have been informed that I underpaid you from the beginning." "Who informed you of that?" "Diane." He said it with a flatness that managed, somehow, to be fond. "She calculated it out on the back of her Latin exercise and presented it to me at breakfast." Janet closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, he was watching her with the expression she had seen across the dinner table and still could not name. And now it was closer, and she could see more of it, and what she saw frightened her in the specific way that good things frighten people who have learned not to trust them. "Lord Major," she said, keeping her voice level by an act of discipline that was becoming harder to sustain. "I don't know what you want from me. I am aware," he said, "that this is the problem." It was the arrival of Mr. Gerald Croft that changed the temperature of everything. He came the second week of January with 2 trunks and the easy confidence of a man who had spent his life in inherited rooms and considered himself entitled to one more. He was Lord Major's cousin, the same cousin Janet understood within the first hour, who had corresponded with Eliza Farrow 7 years ago. He was charming in the way that men are charming when charm is a tool rather than a character trait. And he looked at Janet on their first introduction with the assessing thoroughness of someone cataloging a risk. "The companion," he said, over dinner on his first evening, in a tone that made the word mean something other than what it said. "How long have you been at Major Park?" 2 months, Janet said. Kelly is not usually so attentive to staff retention. He looked at Lord Major with the particular smile of a man delivering a message disguised as pleasantry. Lord Major picked up his wineglass and did not respond. That night, Janet sat in the schoolroom after Diane was asleep and understood several things at once. That Gerald Croft stood to inherit Major Park if Kelly died without legitimate issue, that Kelly was 34 and unmarried, and that the arrival of a female companion in this house, retained personally by Lord Major, would be of considerable interest to anyone watching the succession with invested attention. She understood also that she was now a variable in a game she had not agreed to play. 3 days later, she found Diane crying in the corridor outside the library. Diane did not cry easily or often. The sight of it was arresting in the specific way of seeing something you have not been shown before, and suddenly understanding why it was kept from you. "He told me," Diane said, not looking up. Her voice was controlled in the way of a child who has been taught to perform composure and is currently failing. "Mr. Croft, he said that Kelly only keeps you here because it looks better than an empty house. He said you will be gone by spring." She looked up. "Will you?" Janet sat down on the floor of the corridor with her back against the wall, not because it was dignified, but because it put her at the same level as the child in front of her. "I don't know," she said. "My position here is Lord Major's to decide." "I want to know," Diane said, "if you actually care about staying, or if it is just the salary." It was a remarkable question from an 11-year-old, and it deserved a remarkable answer. "Both," Janet said, "and that is not a contradiction." Diane looked at her for a long time. Then she sat down beside her on the floor of the corridor and said, "He watches you, you know, when he thinks no one is looking." Janet looked at the ceiling. "Just thought you should know," Diane said. The confrontation came 2 weeks after Croft's arrival, during which time he had systematically undercut her authority with Diane, made 3 comments about her position in the household that walked the edge of acceptable, and said nothing to Lord Major that she could have brought as a complaint without appearing small. She did not plan it. She was crossing the entrance hall toward the stairs when she heard Croft's voice through the half-open door of the drawing room. Casual, unhurried, certain of his audience. "You cannot keep her here indefinitely, Kelly. It raises questions. The staff are already talking." A pause. Lord Major's voice, level as always. "The staff are employed to work, not to editorialize. She is a companion. She has no place in your plans, unless—" A pause that carried more content than any sentence. "Unless she does. Which would be a different matter entirely, and one I would strongly advise against." "Your advice," Lord Major said, "was not requested. Your father's will was quite specific about the conditions for inheritance." "I know what my father's will said, Gerald. I was the one who had it contested." A silence. Janet stood in the entrance hall with her hand on the newel post, and her heartbeat steady, steady, steady. The way it went when something was arriving, and there was nothing left to do but face it. She walked to the drawing room door and pushed it open. Both men turned. Croft's expression arrived at something between amusement and annoyance. Lord Major's face showed nothing, but his stillness was different, the kind that happens before a decision, not after one. "Miss Barker," Croft said, with the smile of a man who's about to enjoy himself. "We were just discussing the household arrangements." "I know what you were discussing," Janet said. She kept her voice even because even was the only register she was going to allow herself. "I was in the hall." She looked at Lord Major. "My lord, I want to speak to you. Alone. When you have a moment." "He has a moment now," Croft said. "I was not asking you," Janet said, without looking at him. Croft went still. Beside him, something in Lord Major's face changed. "Gerald," Lord Major said, "would you excuse us?" It was phrased as a request. It did not feel like one. Croft set down his glass with the controlled care of a man performing indifference and left the room, and the door closed behind him with a quiet click that felt, to Janet, like a verdict. Lord Major crossed the room and stood at the fireplace. He looked at the fire, not at her. She said, "I am not a variable in your family's inheritance dispute. I am a person who accepted a position and has fulfilled it, and I will not be managed out of this house by a man who mistakes charm for intelligence. No one is managing you out of this house. Then say so plainly, not to him, to me." See, he turned. In the firelight, with the performance stripped away, he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just been asked to set it down in front of someone. "You asked me once what I wanted from you," he said. "I did. I was not being evasive. I was—" He stopped. His hand moved to the mantel and rested there. I was attempting to understand it myself before I said it aloud. Janet waited. She had learned to wait for him, which was its own kind of information. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of Diane, not because of the household, because this house has been—" He paused, and in the pause she could hear the cost of what he was doing, the precise effort of a man dismantling his own defenses in real time. "Because I have been silent for 7 years, and you are the first person who has sat across from me and simply told me the truth when it cost you something to do so." He moved then, not toward her, but down, one knee meeting the floor in front of the fireplace with the deliberate intentionality of a man who is not performing anything. "I'm not asking for a return on an investment," he said. "I'm asking for the chance to be worth it. The chance to be what this house should have been, instead of what it became." He was not looking at her with hope. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has decided he would rather be honest and refused than dishonest and accepted. Janet looked at him for a long time. "Get up," she said quietly. He stood. "I can forgive you," she said, "for not knowing how to ask for something. I cannot yet give you what you're asking for, but I can—" She stopped and felt in herself the small, terrifying shift of someone stepping out over uncertain ground. "I can stay. I can give you the time to show me whether trust is warranted." "That is all I'm asking for," he said. "Then we agree," she said. And she held out her hand, not romantically, not dramatically, but with the plain directness of a woman who has decided to believe in something and is marking the decision with her body, not her feelings. He took it. His grip was steady and warm and brief. Then she went to bed and lay in the dark and tried to remember who she had been before this house, and found she did not entirely miss her. Gerald Croft left Major Park on a Saturday morning at the end of January. In the polite way that men leave places when they understand that continuing to stay will cost them more than they are willing to spend. Janet did not witness the conversation between the cousins. She learned about it afterward, in pieces, from Mrs. Boyd, who had heard the better part of it through a door that was less solid than anyone in the drawing room had assumed. Lord Major had told Croft, in plain terms, that Major Park and its contents were not subject to his management, that he, Kelly, had no interest in Croft's counsel regarding his household or his personal life, and that if Croft wished to maintain a relationship with the estate and its future, he would do so on the basis of his own merit rather than on the basis of proximity to its inheritance. He had also offered to resolve the question of succession permanently by engaging a solicitor to review the terms of the contested will. He did it quietly, Mrs. Boyd said. Not dramatically. Just, she touched the side of her head once, a gesture that meant considered. The way he does everything when he has decided. Janet held this information. She said nothing about it. But that afternoon, she found a small arrangement of white winter flowers on the windowsill of the schoolroom. Not roses, not anything designed to impress. Just the kind of thing that grows at the edge of the major park gardens, even in January, placed there by hands that knew where to look. Diane picked one up and examined it. "He put those there," she said. "I know," Janet said. "He has never done that before." "I know," Janet said again. Diane looked at her with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to hide what they are thinking. "Are you going to let him be less lonely?" Janet looked at the flowers, at the gray January light coming through the window, at the frost on the moors beyond it, at the estate that had been a prison and was becoming, slowly, room by room, something she was not yet ready to name. "I think we may be letting each other," she said. The weeks that followed were ordinary in a way that Janet had not had access to in a very long time. He revised her salary without ceremony, leaving a document on her desk with a note attached that said only, "Retroactive, as discussed." She read it once and put it in her drawer and did not thank him effusively because he would not have wanted that, and because the thing between them had moved past formality into something that required less ceremony and more honesty. He began to dine differently, not faster, not louder, but more present. He asked Diane about her maps. He asked Janet once what she was reading, and when she told him, he retrieved the same book from the library and read the relevant chapters so that they could discuss them. He did not tell her he loved her. He showed her, instead, a habit of mind that included her. He asked her opinion before making decisions about Diane's education. He stopped the unnecessary formalities in the way they addressed each other by the simple method of beginning to speak to her as though she had a right to his honesty, which was, she thought, the most intimate thing he knew how to offer. She reached for him first, as it turned out, in the library on an evening in March when the fire had burned low and they had been reading in companionable silence for an hour. She set her book down and simply turned her hand over where it lay on the arm of her chair, and he saw it, and his hand moved to cover hers without hesitation, as if the decision had been made long before either of them had needed to declare it. They sat that way for a long time. Outside, the March wind was changing, losing the last edge of winter, finding its way toward something else. His thumb moved once across the back of her hand. That was all. That was everything. The following autumn, when the moors had gone amber and gold, and the library smelled of wood smoke and the particular quality of light that late September produces in rooms where people are genuinely happy, Janet Major, which was her name now, had been for 6 months, was teaching Diane to press botanical samples between the pages of an old encyclopedia when Kelly came in from the south fields with mud on his boots and a very deliberate expression of a man who's trying not to look pleased with himself. Diane said, without looking up, "You are early." "I know," he said. He crossed the room and stopped beside the table where they were working, and he looked at the two of them with the expression Janet had spent a full year learning to read, the one that had been frozen under 7 years of careful management and was now, in this room, in the ordinary afternoon light, entirely unmanaged. Janet set down the pressing cloth and looked up at him. He sat down in the third chair. He picked up a sprig of something Diane had set aside and turned it in his fingers. Then he set it back down and said nothing. This was, she had learned, the way he was happiest. Not in the declared moments, but in the undeclared ones. Present. Quiet. Here. Diane, who had grown 3 inches and had moved on from the Roman Empire to advanced geometry, said, "Are you going to sit there being contentedly silent, or are you going to help with the labeling?" "I can do both," Kelly said. Janet handed him a pen. He took it. She thought, as she had thought before, and would think again, that she had once believed love was a grand thing, a declared thing, a thing that arrived in gestures and speeches and promises made in full view of the world. She knew now that it was mostly this: a chair pulled up to a table, mud on boots that no one complained about, a pen passed between hands that had learned, slowly and at some cost, to trust each other. She pressed a leaf between the pages and turned to the next one. The house held them quietly, as it had learned to do,